Social grants of more than 89,000 children in foster care may not be paid after the end of November if the Social Development Department fails to meet the deadline to process their documentation. The department has a backlog of cases which need to be approved as foster care grants expire after 2 years unless extended by a court order. To discuss this further, we're joined by Dr Katharine Hall, a senior researcher at the Children's Institute. She's in our Sea Point studios in Cape Town. Good to have you, Katharine. Thanks again for being with us here on Morning Live.
Good morning, Leanne.
How would you describe the country's foster care system?
Well, it's a very old system, and it's designed to support children who need to be in the child protection system, because they need to be monitored by social workers. It was originally set up for children who had been abused or neglected or were at risk of abuse or were awaiting adoption, and it was conceptualized as a temporary arrangement. What has happened is that with high rates of orphaning in the country after the AIDS epidemic, the Department of Social Development started enrolling more and more children into a foster care system. So for many years there hadn't been more than 50,000 children in the system, and suddenly by the end of the 2000s we had over 500,000 children in the system. And at that point the system kind of collapsed. As you said, the foster care orders have to be reviewed every 2 years, and this requires a social worker to visit every child and their household to write a report. It's got to go back to the children's court and get another order, and they simply couldn't reach all of these children. And at the same time there were concerns that there weren't enough social workers or social welfare services available to deal with real issues of abuse, because of course most of these children, around 90% of children in the foster care system, are living with their families. They live with grandmothers and aunts, and they don't necessarily need to have their care arrangements regulated. What they need is financial support. So the foster child system includes a grant which is different to the child support grant. The child support grant is 420 Rand a month, and the foster child grant is 1,000 Rand a month. So it makes a very big difference to these families looking after children to be able to receive the grant. Yeah. And the short-term foster care crisis that they're talking about now is the fact that 89,000 foster child orders will expire at the end of November. Yes. If they're not renewed before then. And if that happens, then those grants will lapse. Those children will lose the money. That is the short-term concern. And that's the only reason that those grants are in payment is because there's a High Court order, which has actually been in place since 2011, to stop those grants from lapsing. So for around 9 years, the Department of Social Development has not been able to keep up with the backlog of the large number of children in foster care and the need to renew those grants every 2 years.
So, I mean, if you look at what
that's
you're
talking... That's a short-term problem.
And it's a big problem because, I mean, I just want to reverse a little bit back towards where you spoke about the end of November. So November 28th is that deadline that's been given. And, I mean, the number that we're sitting at right now is the Pretoria High Court has made 89,538 outstanding cases valid until the end of November. How are they possibly going to get to the bottom of that?
Well, we know that, in fact, the Department of Social Development has been in Parliament. The Portfolio Committee on Social Development in Parliament has now required them to report on progress every 2 weeks because there's such concern about it. And this is really good. This is the kind of oversight that Parliament should be giving. What we're concerned about is the kind of that all the resources are now put on reviewing and extending those foster child orders. So courts are at the ready to process huge numbers of foster care orders. Social workers are very busy. There have been requests for additional budget because the provincial departments need more cars, more computers in order to be able to do this. Yes, the Department of Social Development needs more resources, but in a context where many children outside of the foster care system are at huge risk, where we have high rates of violence against children, child abuse, abuse of women, There's a huge need for social services to be providing responsive services to families. So there's a huge amount of effort going into renewing these foster care orders, but it's perhaps putting the emphasis in the wrong place, because there's this enormous need for services. Firstly, prevention services to intervene in cases where women and children are at risk. And secondly, responsive services and therapeutic services where people have been abused. Yeah. This is why the sense is that the foster care system needs to change. And the High Court, you talked about the High Court order, which has kept all these grants in place. But the other aspect of the High Court order is that it required the Department of Social Development to come up with a comprehensive legal solution to the problem, the systemic problem in the foster care system, which is that it cannot handle that large number of children. It should be dealing with a smaller number of children, and then there should be far more focus on providing responsive services to women, children, the elderly, disabled people who are in urgent need of those services.
Yeah. So you work with the Centre for Child Law to try and get this issue resolved. How long has this been going on for, and what seems to be the problem at the Social Development Department?
Okay, so the Centre for Child Law is based at the University of Pretoria, and they were the ones who launched the urgent application in 2011. At that stage, grants did lapse. Over 120,000 grants lapsed between 2010 and 2011. And so they have been involved in this case, and in fact, the Department of Social Development has had to provide them with regular progress reports, which have sometimes been hard to understand all the numbers, and they differ from some of our calculations. It's hard to know through administrative systems that are collected in the provinces just how many foster care orders are outstanding. We at the Children's Institute at UCT have been working very closely with the Centre for Child Law and with a lot of other civil society organisations. We've met regularly over the years, but all of this entire crisis goes back to 2010 and even before, when we started to see that foster care orders could not be renewed in time, could not be extended in time, because there were too many children in the system. Yeah. Civil society organisations, together with the Centre for Child Law and the Children's Institute, have also been thinking about what a comprehensive legal solution could be, and we've engaged with the department around this many times. There is an option, there are alternatives. One alternative is to reduce the size of the foster child system, reduce that burden on social workers to renew all these orders for children who don't necessarily need that intervention, by putting them actually effectively into the child support system, where they get a grant. And the argument is that those families might need a bigger grant than the child support grant, which is only 420 Rand a month. So there's been a reference to something called a CSG Plus, which is a bigger grant, but it's using a much easier system. It's easy to apply for the child support grant. And once you have it, it remains in payment for your whole childhood. You don't need to go back to court. And that idea has in fact been passed by Cabinet. And it's a real option. We haven't seen it clearly in the documentation that the Department of Social Development has been submitting to Parliament. There's an amendment to the Social Assistance Act which potentially allows for it. And the Children's Amendment Bill should be going through Parliament this year. But it doesn't explicitly say what the solution is.
Okay, just quickly to wrap up on this, I mean, you talk about that bill, but what about the Social Assistance Bill? Can this help? Will this help in all of these issues we've been talking about?
Well, it can. If they rely on a clause in that which gives the minister discretionary power to increase the amount of the child support grant for certain categories of children. So, for example, she could increase it for orphaned children who are living with their families, who are living in family contexts. So that is a distinct possibility, but then the Children's Amendment Bill also needs to be very clear that those children don't necessarily need to be in the foster care system. Otherwise, we're going to continue with the same problem that we've had for the last decade.
Yeah.
And what we want to see is attention turning towards more responsive social services to people who are in urgent need, because we need to be working on stopping the cycle of violence, which begins early in childhood. And that's where the attention needs to be focused.
Yeah, it certainly does. And I mean, it has huge repercussions, what we've been talking about. Also, we haven't really touched much on the foster caregivers and the children involved in the impact that it has on them. What impact does this all have?
Well, it'll vary. Some children will have been through the traumatic experience of seeing their parents die, and they may need therapeutic services in addition to the support that their extended family gives them, in which case they need to be able to call on those. But for some families, one of the cases actually right back in 2011 that went to the court, an application for foster care, was a case of two children who had lived since they were tiny with their great aunt and their great uncle. They had been abandoned by their mother from very early. And they'd been living with their aunt and uncle all of these years. They were entitled to the child support grant, as all children are if they're in poor families. But when that mother, who they were not seeing regularly, died, there was an opportunity to apply for a foster child grant, which is a bigger grant. So a lot of what we're seeing is that many of these families are desperately poor. We know that most of the country's orphaned children are cared for by poor families. So there's a huge burden of support. Many of them are in rural areas. They're concentrated particularly in the Eastern Cape, in KwaZulu-Natal and Limpopo. And those families aren't just caring for orphans. You know, we've got 360 at last count, probably around 400,000 children now in the foster care system. But that's not even reaching half the children whose mothers are dead, which is more like 1 million. And then there are 3 million children who are living with extended family whose parents are alive, because they are migrant workers, they're working elsewhere. So there is this enormous burden of care on extended families, and what we need to be doing is finding the right ways to support them with financial assistance through social grants, which needs to be relied on to be regular. We can't have these continuing crises where families worry about losing their source of income. And then we need responsive services to be able to assist them when they need it.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much for talking to us about this issue. Dr. Katharine Hall is a senior researcher at the Children's Institute.